Okay, and can you see the screen okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's sharing the wrong screen again. Hang on. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this presentation was developed in 2017, which was the 100th anniversary of the recapture of Jerusalem, and importantly the Australian Light Horse charge on Beersheba. For us down in this part of the world, a lot of Bible prophecy topics involve the Middle East and Europe and things like that. And the average Joe in the street here doesn't see a lot of relevance in those things. And yet this is an aspect of Bible prophecy which does involve Australia. And the Australian Light Horse is particularly seen as a sort of military tradition here. And people are well aware of the famous battles like particularly Gallipoli with the Anzacs and also the Australian Light Horse at Beersheba. So it attracted a bit of interest in Australia and worked very well to bring around the concept of the 7 times punishment in 2017. Number of reference sources quoted there, including I went and visited the Australian War Memorial Museum in Canberra, which has a lot of information on this as well. So it's quite a lot of factual sources there. There's a few images from a documentary, some of the nice colour images that don't look like they were taken in 1917. They're just screenshots from the movie. And of course, our most important reference comes from the scriptures themselves. So we start off with a bit of prophecy, and there's a little bit of prophecy to go through up front just to get the gist of things. So if you sort of stick with it for a little bit as we just go through a few scriptures, it'll all come together as we go through. Now, I'm going to do this in 2 parts, and the first part covers the events around Beersheba and Abraham's wells, and then the second part regarding Jerusalem, which I think will be next week because it's a relatively long topic. There's a fair bit in it. Now, this is from Genesis chapter 21 and verse 25. It says, "And Abraham reproved Abimelech because of a well of water, which Abimelech's servants had violently taken away. And Abimelech said, I wot not who hath done this thing, neither didst thou tell me, neither yet heard I of it but today. And Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and both of them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves." So it's important that this disputed ownership of the well, that Abraham and Abimelech made a covenant or agreement about it. In verse 29, it says, "And Abimelech said unto Abraham, What mean these 7 ewe lambs which thou hast set by themselves? And he said, For these 7 ewe lambs shalt thou take of my hand, that they may be a witness unto me that I have digged this well. Wherefore he called that place Beersheba, because there they swear both of them. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba." And so there was this covenant, this agreement around the ownership of these wells. And the wells at Beersheba are, the place is still called Beersheba today. And the name Beersheba actually means the well of the sevenfold oath. So even the name of the place today has this scriptural connection. So Beersheba is in the desert to the southwest of Jerusalem. It's about 70 kilometres as the crow flies. So it's not that far away from Jerusalem. Now, the wells at Beersheba still exist today, and this particular one here is purported to be Abraham's well. However, there are a number of well openings in the town that obviously all draw from the same water source. The Arabs believe that this is the original Abraham's well, and it doesn't look anything spectacular. It's just a hole in the ground from which you can get water. Now, the concept of the 7 times punishment, those that have been around for a while may have heard of this, but some may not have. And in a nutshell, the history of ancient Israel was a very turbulent history, and the Israelites turned away from God and were rebellious as much as they were close to God, particularly in their later years. And there was this thing called the 7 times punishment, which is mentioned first in Leviticus chapter 26, which basically talks about Israel as the Old Testament nation being punished for their sins, and it uses the term 7 times. And so verse 21 says, if you walk contrary to me and will not hearken unto me, which was certainly a lot of Israel's history, I will bring you 7 times more plagues upon you according to your sins. And then in verse 24, then will I also walk contrary unto you and will punish you yet 7 times for your sins. And I will bring a sword upon you that shall avenge the quarrel of my covenant. And when you are gathered together within your cities, I will send the pestilence among you, and you shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy. And of course, that's exactly what happened. As the Israel nation went through the period of the kings, and the kings became gradually more corrupt, so did the nation as a whole. Now, in Bible prophecy, a time relates to 360 years. It's called a time. And so 7 times is 2,520 years. Now, 604 BC is generally the date that's used for the beginning of the 7 times punishment. And this is when Jerusalem was captured by Nebuchadnezzar, and a lot of the Israelites were led away to Babylon and so on. And you can read in 2 Chronicles 36, particularly there, of the moment when the Israelite king was led away in chains in 604 BC. Now, if you add 2,520 years to 604 BC, you come to 1917 AD. Those of you that are a bit quick on your maths might go, that doesn't quite add up. And the reason it's 1 year out is because in our calendar, there is no year 0. It's 1 BC or it's 1 AD. There is no year 0. So that's why you might think, oh, that's 1 year out. It's not, in fact. It's a correct calculation. Now, Daniel, the book of Daniel, which of course covers the time of the captivity and beyond and so forth, there is a verse in Daniel 12 that talks about this, and it says, blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days. Now, that doesn't sound like a number that would spring to mind until you realise that this, in the Mohammedan calendar, which is the calendar that was in use in 1917 in Jerusalem, the 1335th year was in fact 1917 AD. Now, the Mohammedan calendar only starts from 622 AD, which was when sort of Islam became prominent through the region there. And shortly after 1917, they actually abandoned the Mohammedan calendar in favour of our Western calendar for everything other than Islamic ceremonial purposes and so on. So it's almost like the calendar sort of served its purpose once the prophecy was fulfilled, and then they sort of pretty much forgot about it. Now, this is a photo of a Turkish coin, which shows both the Western calendar of 1917 and the Mohammedan year 1335. And I've actually got a coin. This is actually my coin. And it shows the correlation of the years. Okay, so that's the year 1917. Then we get to some more specifics in the scriptures. And when it comes to Bible prophecy, the scriptures are extremely specific and extremely accurate. And this is a classic example of that from Haggai, where it's referring to this period of punishment because of the rebellion of Israel and so on. I smote you with blasting and with mildew and with hail in all the labours of your hands. Yet you turn not to me, saith the Lord. Consider now from this day and upward, from the 4 and 20th day of the 9th month, even from the day that the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid. Consider it. Now, the 24th day of the 9th month, at the time this was written, this prophecy, and in this place, the calendar that was in use was the Hebrew calendar of the Old Testament. Okay, so when you have a look at the Hebrew calendar, the days and the months move as you go from year to year. So not every year lines up with our dates exactly, if you know what I mean, because it was a 360-day calendar, not a 365-day calendar. However, for the year 1917, the 24th day of the 9th Hebrew month correlates to the 9th of December in 1917. And that's actually just showing you there from the alignment of holidays and so on in the Jewish calendar, that in fact for 1917, that's exactly the alignment. The 24th of the month Kislev was December the 9th in 1917. Okay, so we've got some very specific years and dates here. If we then look at Isaiah 31, it says in verse 1, woe to them that go down to Egypt for help and stay on horses and trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong. But they look not unto the Holy One of Israel, neither seek the Lord. And I want you to remember about those that go to Egypt for help because they are very strong and they have many horses and chariots and all that sort of stuff. And because we're going to link up to this in part 2 of this. And so it's just important that you remember about that little bit. And in verse 4, it says, so shall the Lord of hosts come down to fight for Mount Zion and for the hill thereof. As birds flying, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. And defending also, he will deliver it, and passing over, he will preserve it. Doesn't make a lot of sense just yet, but it will as we go through. So if you put all those prophecies together and go, well, what are we actually looking for here? It is the well of Beersheba being returned to the descendants of Abraham, which of course is the Jewish people. Jerusalem is going to be captured. It's going to happen in 1917. December 9th is to be a key day. It's going to involve birds flying, and Jerusalem is going to be preserved. And so there's actually a lot of individual prophecies there. And for all of those to come together at the same time would be an absolute remarkable coincidence for 6 particular bits of detail to all drop into place. Now, today, we're only going to look at part one of the 5. Don't get too worried because the other 5 go pretty quickly. So now we'll turn to the well of Beersheba and it being returned to the descendants of Abraham. So a little bit of history now. So during the period 1914 to 1917 in World War I, there was a lot of discussion about the future of the Jewish community, and the modern day Jews particularly wanted a homeland, and the British government was very supportive of that, and they were looking to re-establish a permanent home for scattered Jews, not only through the British Empire at that time, but also from other parts of the world. This is a letter from Louis Brandeis, who was the Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court, to the President of the Federation of American Zionists, sort of saying that, gee guys, we thank you for trying to set up this homeland for us. That was fairly key that this happened in 1917. We now turn to the Australian Light Horsemen, who were a military division. The Australian Light Horsemen still exists today as a division of the Australian Army. They don't ride horses anymore, but the principle of what the Australian Light Horsemen do still remains. Now, a lot of people think the Australian Light Horse were cavalry in the traditional sense, but they weren't. They did not fight on their horses generally. They used the horses to move quickly and to surprise the enemy and to get in position very quickly. When they were in position, they dismounted from their horses and fought as what you might say traditional infantry. So they had rifles and bayonets, and they didn't have swords or lances, so they weren't equipped to fight from their horses. Now, there were 800 light horsemen from a couple of divisions that were involved in the charge on Beersheba. So it is unusual for the Australian Light Horse to actually mount a charge on horses, because it wasn't how they were trained or equipped to fight. That was their standard weapon there, the Lee Enfield rifle, which was a short-barreled rifle, which was easy to handle while you're riding on a horse. And there's a photograph there from World War I of a typical Australian light horseman soldier on his horse. They called them whalers, the particular type of horse that they used. Now, the guy in charge was this man, Henry Chevelle, or Harry Chevelle, they called him. And he was in charge of 28,000 troops in the Middle East in World War I, including the 1st Division of the Australian Light Horse. After the charge on the well at Beersheba, he got a promotion out of it because of the remarkable capture of these wells. These couple of quotes are from a book written by his daughter, and she says that the vitality of his own faith is not without evidence. He carried with him on all his campaigns a copy of the Bible. One of the most descriptive features of his faith was the veneration of the Bible as the supreme authority. And there is strong evidence that Harry Chevelle actually understood these Bible prophecies that we have looked at and realised that he was part of fulfilling those prophecies. There's a photograph there of the Australian Light Horse with Chevelle out the front from 1915, a couple of years prior. And you can see the general landscape around that region of the time. And this is the approach to Beersheba, not the actual charge, but when they were sort of approaching the town of Beersheba. Pretty grainy, not terribly good photo, but that's a genuine photo there. So the whole thing about Beersheba is it was a very strategic point from a military point of view, and having water for the troops and the horses and so on was absolutely critical to being a military success in the Middle East 100 years ago. Now, the Australian Light Horse charge on Beersheba was not the first attempt to try and capture this very strategic town with its wells of water. The British and also Australian New Zealand forces, of which there were 60,000 there, had made a number of attempts, and they were unsuccessful. And one of the critical things is as they made that approach on Beersheba, there was no water for them to access. So you sort of had to start from your previous sort of point of water and march through the desert to get to Beersheba, then try and mount your military attack, and then you had to get back to your water before everybody died of thirst. Because these 60,000 men, including the Australian Light Horse, were pushing into the desert, 400,000 gallons was their immediate need for water. So if they didn't get this water, they were going to have to lick their heels and go home. Now, the brass within the British military recognised that water was key to their whole Palestine campaign, and that they would never get through the Beersheba line and further to Jerusalem unless they captured the wells at Beersheba because of the need for water. That's one of the screenshots from the movie there, by the way. That's not a real photo. So on the 31st of October, 1917, which is about 6 weeks before this critical date that we're looking at, the 9th of December in 1917, Chauvel issues orders to storm Beersheba before nightfall. And so they didn't really have much of a plan. All they were going to do is take 800 horsemen and charge the trenches that were manned by the Turkish. Now, it sounds like an absolute suicide mission, and probably from a logical perspective, it was. There was 6 kilometres of open plains with no cover at all as you approached the trenches with the Turkish machine guns all lined up there. So to cross 6 kilometres of open ground against a line of machine guns would seem an impossible task. And the German officer there, he later describes the light horsemen as madmen for even attempting this. So it was sort of a pretty desperate move, I guess you could say, by Chauvel to try this. But remember that those comments about Chauvel and the fact that he saw the Bible as the Word of God and was aware of his potential position in regard to some of these prophecies. Maybe he sort of went for the mad plan because he understood that maybe God would have a hand in this. So there's a little map of the approach to Beersheba and the trenches on the run up there that they faced and so on. Okay, now the other thing is that the wells were set up with explosives so that if the town of Beersheba did fall, the plan was simply to blow up the wells so that the ground would cave in and prevent the enemy from having access to the water. So that was like the last resort or the retreat plan from the German and Turkish military. So Chauvel was aware of this, that if they didn't make a very sudden capture, that there would be nothing there to capture. So we've got the 4th and the 12th Light Horse Regiments. The 4th there, which is the Victorian division of the Australian Light Horse, is just over the border from us. And we put this presentation on at the Narracourt Town Hall in 1917. And we hired this room in the meeting hall, and did a lot of pamphleting and outreaching and had several new people there and so on. And what we didn't realise when we did this is in the room that we hired was one of these big honour roll plaque things on the wall behind where the speaker would stand. And there were the names of a number of local Narracourt men who were part of the 4th Light Horse Brigade, just over the border there. So it had particular relevance locally here as well, as there were a number of local soldiers in 1917 that were part of this. Now, interestingly enough, this was actually the last major horse-mounted charge in military history. It was the most haphazard and hastily organised military plan that you could ever have. And it goes down in history as one of the most remarkable. So 4:30 in the afternoon on October the 31st, 1917, this charge begins across this 6 kilometres of open ground. Now, I've got a couple of quotes here from eyewitnesses that we're part of the campaign in Beersheba. First one says, "It is the boast of the German engineers that the redoubts, which are the defences of Beersheba, are impregnable, and that it was ridiculous to imagine mounted troops could destroy the redoubts surrounding Beersheba. Intelligence informs us that the Turks have mass guns along the Beersheba front. Here goes for the great fight and the grandest charge of mounted men in history." And so away they went across this, galloping across this 6 kilometres of open ground. Idris says, "From the flanks, Turkish machine guns took over the defence. The tough Turkish infantry had been unnerved by the seemingly invincible horde bearing down on them. As the horsemen galloped nearer, the excited Turks forgot to lower their sights and began firing high. Bullets buzzed harmlessly overhead as the squadrons thundered across the last mile, jumping their mighty whalers, the horses, over the trenches." Now, anybody who knows anything about guns and projectiles, when you fire a bullet, as the bullet travels through the air, it gradually drops. And when you want to fire to a target that starts from 6 kilometres away, you adjust your sights to compensate for the drop of the bullet under the force of gravity as it travels on its trajectory. And so their machine guns were set up to hit a target in the distance, but of course the speed of the galloping horses meant that they got close fairly quickly, and the Turks still had not adjusted their sights for close warfare rather than distant, and so their shots were hopelessly inaccurate. Another eyewitness, a trooper by the name of Vic Smith, says, "Of course we were scared, wishing to hell we weren't there, but you couldn't drop out and leave your mates to it. You had to keep going on." And so they knew that this was a sort of a suicide mission, but away they went. It was the bravest, most awe-inspiring sight I've ever witnessed, and they were yelling, swearing and shouting. There were more than 500 Aussie horsemen, in fact there were 800. As they thundered past, my hair stood on end. Boys were wild-eyed and yelling their heads off. At a mile distance, their 1,000 hooves were a stuttering thunder, coming at a rate that frightened a man, an awe-inspiring sight, galloping through a red haze, knee to knee and horse to horse, the dying sun glinting on their bayonet points. So there are a few descriptions. What actually happened was the first lot of horsemen that had jumped over the trenches went through and on into the town where these wells were mined. And it happened that the German officer who had set up all the explosives and so on was on leave. And so the bloke filling in perhaps wasn't the quickest man off the mark. He was in the act of exploding the mines when a trooper called Bolton shot him, galloped up and shot him. So the 17 wells that were in the town, only 2 were demolished. Despite the Turkish lines and the machine guns, only 32 men were killed and 36 wounded. And they captured 38 officers in Beersheba, 1,200 soldiers, 14 field guns and associated vehicles. So an absolutely remarkable effort for what was seen as a complete suicide mission. So when we look at the prophecies there, we see the first one is sort of ticked off there in that now the well of Beersheba has been recaptured and shortly to be returned to the Jews. Now, what's our time? Do we want to keep going, Anthony, or is that enough for today? Let's
You could probably go for one more if you wanted.
Yeah, okay. All right. So we'll keep going a little bit further.
Yeah.
So that's the first aspect of prophecy that's ticked off. The five more that we've got happen a little bit quicker, but perhaps we'll go a little bit further before you get brain overloaded. So now we get to something called the Balfour Declaration. Now, the same day as this charge on Beersheba in 1917, the British War Cabinet was meeting, and they came up with this outcome, which was called the Balfour Declaration later on. So that was named after James Balfour, who was the British Foreign Secretary. And there is actually a letter about this that's in the Australian War Museum there to Rothschild, and in it it says this: His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So this was a commitment made by the British Parliament on the day that the wells at Beersheba were captured. And the modern nation of Israel did not exist in 1917. The history of Jerusalem from 604 BC is a checkered one, where the city of Jerusalem and the surrounding area had been under various military controls for 2,520 years, and for the last 1,300 or so of those years, Jerusalem was controlled by the Arab and Turkish Muslims, and so Jerusalem as a city was not the homeland of the Jews, and there was no nation of Israel. Now, Palestine, which was what the region was called, was going to be the area targeted as a homeland for the Jews. And it's very significant that this decision was made on the same day as the charge on the wells at Beersheba. Now, there's a British guy by the name of Field Marshal Allenby, and he was in charge of British troops in the Middle East at that time. And his surname, Allenby, translated into Arabic, pronounced Allah Enibi, actually means prophet of the Lord. And a remarkable coincidence that this was this man's name. And he becomes very prominent in the recapture of Jerusalem. Now, before he headed off to Cairo, where they were based at the time, Allenby had a meeting with General Sir Balfour de Lisle, I think is how you pronounce that, and he had pointed out to him the prophecies relating to the deliverance of Jerusalem and the 7 times punishment and the relevance of the year 1917. And this is actually recorded in military history. He also met with Lord Fisher, who was, I think he was the dude in charge of the British Navy at the time. And he told Allenby that he would be God's instrument to capture Jerusalem in December 1917, and also told him that aircraft would be essential to the success of the campaign. And if you bear in mind that aircraft in 1917 weren't particularly powerful military tools, and they were used mostly for observation, where they would fly over the enemy ranks and sort of see how many were there and where they were and all that sort of stuff. But aircraft were not the military fighting force that they are today. At a briefing with Allenby, the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George at the time in Britain, he told Allenby that he wanted Jerusalem as a Christmas present for the British nation, which was a rather bizarre thing to ask for, but there you go. So by December, bear in mind that the capture of the wells and the water happened on the 31st of October. So early December, the British artillery, now that they can advance that 70 kilometres between Beersheba and Jerusalem, given that they've now got water to back them up, had approached Jerusalem with their artillery and had started firing the guns and so on. Now, Allenby didn't particularly want to return fire against Jerusalem because he recognised the significance of the ancient city and a lot of its buildings and relics and all this sort of stuff. And he was a bit nervous about just flattening Jerusalem with artillery fire. So he sends a message saying, you know, what do I do about this? I don't really want to flatten Jerusalem. And so the Parliament sends back the reply to do that which you deem to be necessary. In other words, don't care what you do, just make sure you get us Jerusalem for Christmas. And so puts Allenby then in a very difficult position in that he doesn't want to use traditional warfare and just shell the place, but he gets no useful information or no useful instruction from his superiors. So he calls in the 14th Bomber Squadron. And very interestingly, the 14th Bomber Squadron has a motto, and it's written in Arabic text on their insignia or whatever you want to call it, which is shown there in the image. And you can see down the bottom the Arabic text, which actually comes from the Quran, and it translates as, "I spread my wings and I keep my promise." Now, it's very bizarre that a British bomber squadron would have a motto that not only is written in Arabic, but also comes from the Quran. And you'll see the significance of this in a moment. But you can see there's all these remarkable coincidences that just can't be there without a reason. And so that's the 14th Bomber Squadron with their mighty planes, as you can see there, sort of made out of, I think, wooden frames and canvas wings and all this sort of stuff, very fragile things as they were in those days. And so he gets these old biplanes to fly over the city. Now, there is a fair bit of anecdotal evidence and reports that they dropped leaflets telling the Turks to flee Jerusalem and to surrender the city. Now, I say that it's anecdotal evidence because in the official military records, there is no record of Allenby actually doing this. And I found this out because I actually wanted to get a copy of one of these leaflets when I prepared this presentation. So I went searching the 14th Bomber Squadron records and all this sort of stuff and could not find this, and looked into it a bit more. And there are many verbal reports of this happening, but nothing in the official military record. And it is thought that the reason for this is because Allenby and his name, which translated into Arabic, which the leaflets were in Arabic, as by the will of God, would seem to be an inappropriate or a wrong thing to do, not a proper thing to do, to use a religious connotation or pretend that he was God's instrument and so on. And so it's an interesting little part of the story about the leaflets that were dropped. But it's highly likely that that's actually what occurred because of the resulting action by the Turks. Now, after this reply of do that which you deem necessary, which wasn't very helpful for General Allenby, he then, instead of talking to the Parliament, he actually messages the King, George V at the time, for some guidance. And the King's reply was, pray about it. And in a natural sense, that probably wasn't any more help than what the Parliament have said as do that which is necessary. So he's still got no specific instruction or whatever about how to recapture Jerusalem. But the King's reply was pray about it. And so that's what he did. He got his staff together and they actually prayed about what they were going to do about Jerusalem. And a few hours after they had prayed, the Turkish artillery stopped firing and the Turkish army surrendered the city and just fled. So what's that? That's an hour, so that's probably enough for today. And it's probably a good point to end with Allenby and his crew praying about the recapture of Jerusalem. So in part 2, we'll start to look at some of the detail around that and how it ties in with the prophecies regarding Jerusalem. All right. Is that probably far? That's far enough, isn't it, Anthony?
Yeah, that's perfect. That was great. Thanks very much. Yeah. Excellent stuff. Very clear.
Okay. Yeah. Any questions on all that? Not suggesting I'm the great authority that can answer all of them, but